Hello, today I'm showing off a bit of a weird build I've been working on recently. It's based on the stat stacker kind of builds that have been going around everywhere lately. Uses the very common setup of Pillar of the Cage God with Hand of Wisdom in action, which gives you a crazy amount of damage, but more importantly, as you can kind of see here, it gives you a pretty ridiculous amount of area of effect, which is resulting in these Herald of Ice explosions that are covering basically the entire screen, and these melee attacks that are hitting enemies 2 screens away. So it's pretty fun, and basically I've just kind of janked together parts of various builds. So I've seen some setups where people, for example, use free dragons in order to enable Herald of Ice, but instead I've been using the however you pronounce the ring. There's this ring out there that makes it so that your Herald of Ice triggers from chill instead of freeze, is the gist of it, and because Stormweaver can trigger chill with any damage type, you can end up using those two together to have your Herald of Ice trigger off of literally everything build. And it results in this nonsense that you can see here. The clear is extremely good. It's also, thanks to it being Stormweaver and starting at the top of the tree, very easy to turn this into an energy shield build. You don't have the highest energy shield in the world, but we get to a pretty comfortable 4.7k, around 9k with Grim Beast, and here we have the Breach. This is what the build was designed to do. Essentially, the build's okay at bossing, but what it's really good at is these ridiculous screen-wide clears that you are seeing inside of this Breach. We throw out an attack, everything blows up. It feels very, very good to play. And that's kind of the gist of it. So yeah, I'll just kind of let the footage run for a little bit. Let's see. It's just one attack and everything explodes. Older rares just get covered in explosions from Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. And yeah, I just kind of skipped the whole Breach Splinter collecting part there at the end. Yep, has an entire tier 15 map cleared. It's not the most dangerous tier 15 map, but it's just nice to be able to run very dense breaches like that from extreme safety with a high energy shield pool. Particularly compared to Thaumaturges, where even if you invest a decent amount, even if you have like a decent chunk of strength, you're still gonna have less life of energy shield builds. Alright, so now that we've talked a bit about it, now that we've shown the build off and what it actually looks like, let's talk a little bit about how this works. So, like I mentioned previously, this ring right here, Pulsar is pretty much what the three uniques this is based off of is Pulsar, Hand of Wisdom, and Cage God. So these two are very traditional stat stacking characters. You see this a lot on Thaumaturge, where people run these two together, and especially with a lot of intelligence, but you end up having somewhere from a 200% increased area. And that works really well with a lot of monk abilities. Is Stormwave gets this insane range that you see in maps. Tempest Flurry hits more consistently. Tempest Spell hits more easily, and most notably, Herald of Ice ends up with a radius that covers like half of a screen. It's 4 which is completely insane. The other thing that this does, though, well, the two things that happen are, for one, when you're playing Hand of Wisdom in action, you have a shit ton of lightning damage. And the problem with Herald of Ice is Herald of Ice, by default, needs a freeze to be triggered, and normally you can only get a freeze. So your options for dealing with that are to either use Free of Dragons, which lets your lightning damage freeze. You can use a Coal of Brotherhood, which turns your lightning damage into gold. Or you can use Pulsar, which makes your chills shatter enemies, which can trigger Herald of Ice instead of freeze. Problem is chill is also applied by cold, but we have a way of working around this by using the Stormweaver ascendancy, which has the passive that all of our damage can apply chill. So, unlike Free Dragons and unlike Full of Brotherhood, we don't actually have freeze in our build, which is a bit unfortunate. It does make bossing a lot scarier because the enemies can actually fight back, but we still apply somewhere around a 50% action slow penalty to enemies. So, a lot of bossing is much more comfortable. I still die to Zesh more often than I care to admit, just because I'm shit at the fight, but in general, when it comes to dealing with various map bosses and stuff, this just works out fine. So, one other thing that's really awesome about this, which is something I've seen in On the Crown's video and Maffle's video, is Pulsar Callan will actually allow your Herald device to proc itself, because normally, if you look at this Herald device generator, it says that it's a payoff generator, and payoff skills cannot inflict the debuff they interact with. Well, since Herald device is triggered from shatters, I'm presuming what it means is that Herald device itself cannot freeze, because freeze is normally what is associated with shatters. But Herald device can still chill. And this is why Pulsar Callan kind of breaks the ability. Or what you end up seeing happening in that map is the Herald device procs, even though it can't freeze, it can still chill because all of lightning damage that it's doing, because it is doing lightning damage. From Hand of Wisdom action is applying the chill from Shaper of Winter, which then gives us a shatter and triggers itself. So that ends up being extremely powerful. And another nice thing is, even though we don't freeze, because we're still technically dealing lightning damage, we can still apply shock. And that gets a bit silly because our character can shock people twice, because that's just something the Stormweaver ascendancy does. We also chill twice, which gets us higher action speed slows. And we also have this node here, the Taken Reboot, which is kind of comfortable. It's not that noticeable. This one's definitely like before you pick. You're gonna feel that weak without it. It's really more so B's free that we pick the ascendancy for. But anyway, let's talk about shock for a moment. Shock is very, very strong. It makes enemies take essentially 20% more damage by default, so having a second one makes it take 40% more damage. But there's a stat in the game called Shock Magnitude, which you'll see on various passives scattered around the tree. And Shock Magnitude increases the more damage multiplier it's essentially giving you. Now, I don't have a lot of it actually spec'd on the tree itself, but what I do have is a lot of it on jewels. I have a bunch of jewels which cost me like 1 to 10x. They're extremely cheap. And these jewels can roll up to 15% magnitude. I have, I think, about 130, 140% magnitude. And my shocks end up doing around 47% more damage each. So my double shock is actually making enemies take 90% more damage, which, especially with how many Herald of Ice explosions are going off in breaches, is why you see a bunch of those rare monsters just get completely one-shot, because they're being hit by a bunch of Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. And they just have no way of surviving. The fact that they're taking all of those hits on top of a 94% shock, on top of all the other nonsense that this build is. So that's a rough idea of the Ascendancy. I wasn't very impressed by Thaumaturge, which is kind of why I swapped off of it. Because when you're playing Pillar of the Caged God, you have more than enough attributes to run everything. So one Ascendancy point gets wasted there. You get like the double bonuses from attributes, which is kind of nice. You get more mana from your int, which makes your mana costs easier to manage. You get more accuracy from your dex, which you have more than enough accuracy anyway, so who cares? And you get more life from your strength, which is actually a pretty nice amount of life, but life is just a shit defense at the moment. This character has what I think the amount of energy shield I have would be considered kind of shit for an energy shield character. It's very easy for characters to get like 6 to 10k, but compared to a life character, this is insanely high. Right? Even with like when my Thaumaturge was around 500 strength, because I was more heavily based on strength than dex and int. I had like 3.4k life. This build on its own is 4.7k energy shield, which then with Grim Beast, what it's called, goes up to 9.4k while clearing breaches, and just ends up being stupidly tanky. And we also have a weapon swap, which is basically entirely around just giving us more energy shield. If you look at my passive tree, everything in my weapon swap is just energy shield recharge and more energy shield stuff, which I use in boss fights to when I'm scared because I need to tank something, like in Visage fight when I'm running around trying to dodge with slam hands. I also have Blink in my weapon swap because that feels good. So yeah, that feels quite nice. One thing that's important to mention as well is I don't have that much faster start of energy shield recharge in my weapon swap. I do have a lot of energy shield recharge. You'll see this is like 3 times as high in my weapon swap as it is in my regular one, which is very nice when you don't have access to a bunch of things to kill for you. So you can just go to your swap and chill out there at the heal table. The reason I don't have faster start, though, which I was originally considering, because in theory it's like, oh, you stack up like a crazy amount, somewhere from 100 to 300%, and get your like energy recharge delay down from 4 seconds to 1 second. Problem is, if I get hit and I swap to a weapon, if I get hit and I have no recharge modifier and I swap to my other weapon and it recharges 4 times as fast, I still have to wait the full 4 seconds. It's actually based on the weapon you have equipped when you initially do the swap, not based on the weapon you're in while you're charging. So you have to actually be in your weapon swap when you get hit to get the benefits of that faster recharge, which will require you to preempt the swap, which just wasn't for me. Anyway, we just grab a shit ton of energy shield and climb up here. You need a lot of this stuff. The energy shield is additional stun threshold. I didn't want to waste passive points on it, so I got it on various jewels. Essentially, for my jewels are usually like stun threshold, chance to inflict ailments, magnitude of ailments. The crit magnitude doesn't actually. This one it's the chance and the stun, but I got this one for. Some of them have attack speed, some of them have dex corruptions. This node here gives percent int, not just energy shield, so it's mandatory. Whispers of Doom is nice. We run Hand of Chayula. Instantly applies temp chains and enfeeble without using their mana cost, which I think might be a bug, but I'm not sure. This is very nice when you're bossing. It just gives you even more slows to pair with your chill, and it gives a significant less damage multiplier so that enemies are easy to deal with. This is a lot of damage. More energy shield, more int. Chaos inoculation, because let's signal chaos damage. It's really nice. Which, also speaking of, since we're CI, this node becomes a lot better because only damage type in the game that we don't Riku is now physical because we ignore chaos and we Riku elemental. Wildstorm is very nice. It's a decent more damage multiplier, especially because all the way down here we get Lightning Rod, which gives us lucky damage. Those two pair together to give us a lot of damage. Then, as we're climbing down here, I grab Martial Artistry. We get a bit of attack speed from here and a lot of dex from here. Go down here and I get the attack speed from dex here, the roll dex here, dual socket while I'm here. It's also worth mentioning, like, jewel sockets are extremely good. Eventually, I just started picking random jewel sockets without any other passives nearby because the stats they give are so valuable. And, oh yeah, speaking of, one of your jewels needs Rage on hit, because Rage can give you up to 30% more damage. I also use Rage support on Stormwave to make it easier to maintain. But you do actually want Rage on hit on the jewel even if you're using the support, because that way, if I'm not using Stormwave, but I'm jumping on bosses with like Hand of Chayula and Tempest Flurry and the Bell, my Rage isn't going down while I'm doing that. because if you stop using whatever's building rage for 2 seconds, you lose it all. So that jewel just makes it much easier to. Farsighted. Let's talk about Farsighted. This thing, I think, is very important to allowing the chaining to continue, because accuracy in PoE 2 is very different. PoE 1, if my accuracy says I have a 100% chance to hit, then I have a 100% chance to hit, except maybe it's the evasive monsters. PoE 2, look at accuracy, you'll see that accuracy is actually 90% lower for enemies that are too far away from us. That penalty is really absurd. Actually not. Oh, yeah, that penalty is really absurd. And that occurs 12 meters away from us, which you can kind of think of as just being like off screen is 12 meters away, I think, because your presence radius is 6 meters, which is something like this. And with how far Herald of Ice is going, it means it's pretty much always experiencing that 90% less accuracy penalty. So even though our regular accuracy for our skills is, where is it, 2000, which sounds good, it's a 100% hit chance, that actually means it's 200 at Farsighted, which is really, really low. I'm not sure what the hit chance is on that, but it's probably low. So this reduces that penalty to the point that I think it's 63% instead of 90%, which means we're left with around 800 accuracy instead, which is a lot better. We then also put some accuracy supports on Herald of Ice with Bullseye, so that we have even more accuracy, just so that this can keep chaining and doesn't randomly start missing it. And it's felt very good. And then, yeah, we're just kind of pathing all the way down here. In theory, you could anoint Polymathy, which is the node that gives us 10% increased attributes, but I really like having Lightning Rod and Jack of all trades in the build as well. So I actually like just pathing down here. Plus, all of this stuff on the side feels good, so I don't mind spending all of these passives on attributes, especially because I'm getting a bunch of sockets on the way. I really like how jewel sockets feel in the game at the moment. But yeah, Polymathy, increased attributes, have to pick it for an attribute stacker. Jack of all trades, we have a decent distribution of attributes, so it's like 60% increased damage. And Lightning Rod is very, very good. We don't scale crits, so this is like 30% more damage, especially with Wildstorm, which gives us more maximum. And Lucky damage is really, really nice, because the thing I've noticed about lightning damage builds is they can feel pretty awful without this. Because even though I, technically speaking, have pretty decent damage on my Stormwave hits, it's 1,600 to 16,000. The thing you have to understand, right, is that means sometimes I'm doing 1,600 damage. Sometimes I'm doing 10% of the damage that this skill can do, because the variance on it is so high. And when that happens, that feels awful. As you throw out a Stormwave into a pack of monsters, you expect it to kill them, the damage low rolls, and you're like, and then you have to walk back there, strike him again. Feels weird. So, Lucky damage makes that much less likely to happen, and it's especially nice for Herald of Ice, because you don't want your Herald of Ice to low roll, because otherwise you risk it kind of breaking the chain between the explosions, so Lucky just helps keep those damage rolls high. So that's a rough idea of the passive tree. Moving on, we have essentially 4 of our gear slots taken up by uniques, because our Pillar of Cage God is 2-handed, and the Wisdom in Action uses up our gloves, and Pulsar Cannon uses up our ring slot. Actually going into this, but the most expensive part of this build is Hand of Wisdom in Action. You do not need an Astromantis for this. Like, I don't have one myself. I don't know how the hell I would farm up one. These things are way too expensive. Hand of Wisdom in Action is pretty reasonable. It's like 5 to 7 divines. And the rest of his gear cost me like 1 to 10x. These corruptions, I just was randomly corrupting ones that I was randomly corrupting Pillars of the Cage God that I found myself, eventually hit the extra socket, and that felt nice. And the Pulsar Count I just got ridiculously lucky on. I bought a decent one and figured I'd just slam a corruption on it because what's the worst that can happen and hit probably the best possible roll. So yeah, that feels incredible. But anyway, one of the problems we run into with all of these slots taken up is it's kind of hard to get our resistances. So you'll notice in all of our gear we usually have like 1 to 2 resists. I also tried to get rarity where I can. That's one of the reasons I didn't like free dragons as well, because if you use your helmet slot for free dragons, you can't use it for a rarity helm, which, even though I only have 24% rarity on this, still feels good, and it's a decent chunk of energy shield compared to the 60 or something that's on free dragons. So being able to use an actual helmet feels very nice. And our rarity is 76%. It's not amazing, but rarity has, from what I heard, diminishing returns past 100%, so it's important to just have a decent amount of it, not necessarily like hundreds of it. But yeah, so our gear, mediocre amount of energy shield, a resist stat, intelligence, and rarity. Intelligence, resist, mediocre amount of energy shield, 2 resistance strength. Belts are really shit. They don't have any valuable prefixes for us. They don't actually have valuable prefixes for most builds, so pretty much ignore the prefixes and just look for resistances that help you in the attributes. I would also recommend get the belt and the ring last, because these will fix your resistances. These are the slots where you have them. It's like, try to get resistances on these 4 pieces, but do understand that these are the 2 pieces that will fix most of your resistances after everything. Boots, probably the most expensive ones. You want rarity, resists, attribute, and move speed. Move speed in particular is mandatory. You can technically drop one of the other 3, but that's amulet. Just get a crazy amount of attributes. People don't seem to like to run the attribute stackers without Astramentus, so they are severely undervaluing just a good necklace with a lot of attributes and rarity on it. Which also, speaking of, should probably bring up the Anoint on this. Unbound Forces is a decent Anoint. Yeah, I'm sure there's better ones, but the main reason I picked this is because it's cheap. It only costs like 7x to Anoint. And it gives you both of your valuable magnitudes, right? 25% shock in particular is like both your shocks are getting an extra 5% more damage multiplier. And it gives you shock and chill duration, which, especially because our ascendancy halves our shock duration, it makes this feel a lot nicer. You don't randomly end up with your ailments expiring, thanks to this. And lastly, the ring. Ring is pretty good. It's few resistances, intelligence, and added lightning damage to attacks. A lot of resistances, actually. Like, if I drop this ring, all of my resistances are up. They stop being capped. So having all of that, and on top of that, a decent intelligence roll, and on top of that, added lightning damage is nice. And the added lightning damage does matter. If you look at Hoa, right, Hoa gives us 1 to 10 lightning damage per 10 int. This is 2 to 46, which is comparable to 4 to. So this is kind of like 40 intelligence worth of added lightning damage. So in some ways, it's like a 65 imp ring. Kind of. And yeah, our weapon swap is very placeholder. I didn't put much effort into it. I just put on a 40% block shield and pretty much called it a day. I put on a scepter because I thought I would need the spirit, but I didn't, because I could just turn off my 2 heralds. One other thing that's kind of... Actually, I'll get into that later. Yeah, and we also... as cursed as this is, I took Guiding Palm because it has light radius, because that makes it a bit easier to just find things while you're mapping. Shows you more of a layout and swap stuff when you're moving around thinking. It's probably a dumb idea, but
I need more time.
may as well get what you can on your swap. Sure, there's more setups, but it works. You are level 89. Okay. Actually not. Turning T15s pretty nicely. kind of spamming breach around the map. I haven't actually found a single citadel yet, as far as I can tell, although I have found the burning monolith. So that's pretty annoying. Like 100. Still haven't found shit. Yeah. And then I guess the skills are the last thing to cover. Stormwave is the AoE you saw us spamming in the map. And essentially we use Upheaval here. I sometimes take this off during boss fights because, as you can tell, it like halves my damage. But it gives that a really nice triple hit. I like it. I think we have enough damage that it's worth it. But if you're struggling with damage, I can see the reason for dropping it. And I usually just take it off boss fights. Rage I pick because the build-up just helps with all of our other attacks. We can pretty safely use Stormwave, so we're pretty much always just building up Rage from it. So it's very nice. It's constantly giving us significant more damage multiplier to our heralds. Primal Armament, some more weapon damage multiplier. It's got to go on one of our damaging attacks. Lightning Infusion goes here as well. Lightning Infusion's really nice. There's actually not that many attacks that this one is good on, because we'll go into Tempest Bell in a moment. Tempest Bell gains a lot of added fire damage from some of the setup that we're doing. Tempest Flurry is not really used for damage. Hand of Chayula isn't used for damage. We could put on Herald of Ice. It does have a little bit of base cold damage, but it doesn't really. So, Lightning Infusion either goes here or Herald of Ice. Tempest Bell is fun. That's our bossing abilities. I don't think I actually used it at all in the map that I showed off. Probably show some later of how much damage this does to bosses, but it is pretty ridiculous. While most of our stuff is geared towards mapping, this Tempest Bell Infernal Cry combo is how we deal with bosses, and lets us deal millions of damage in a couple of multiple millions of damage over like 2 to 3 seconds. It's very good. We use Rage Forge, consumes Rage to get a lot of bonus damage. Since we only slam Tempest Bell once in like a 10-second interval from Hourglass, Rage Drain doesn't matter too much. Particularly because we're building up Rage quite a lot, and we also have our Infernal Cry, which generates Raging Cry support. Elemental Focus. This support is a bit of an awkward one, because we love our Shock and Chill, so we want to always be applying it. But something has to... We don't have that many damage multipliers, so we want to put Elemental Focus somewhere. And frankly, since we aren't like applying Freeze or anything, and our Tempest Flurry is usually enough to apply Shock and Chill to enemies. Well, Tempest Flurry, Stormwave, Herald of Ice, all of our other stuff will be applying the ailments well enough, so you don't mind losing it on Tempest Spell that much. Conk Effect, just a lot more damage. I don't like the less area on it, but we have so much increased area that counteracts it, and it's for bossing, not clearing it, so it's good enough. And then Hourglass. I always feel a bit conflicted about Hourglass. It essentially depends on how much damage you have. But especially if you're like entirely focused on pairing it with Infernal Cry, it doesn't make a lot of sense because you're waiting on Infernal Cry anyway. Beat your next Tempest Spell, but it can also be nice to just throw out your 4 attacks, plop down the bell, and then just keep hitting the bell, and immediately be able to reuse it if you don't have Hourglass. So this is a much burstier way to set it up. Infernal Cry gives us a crazy amount of extra damage. It's up to 100%, which we always get when we're up against uniques. And against rares, we get... Actually, I think against rares... Rares are 5 power. Okay, yeah, uniques always give us 100%, rares don't. So it's especially good at bossing. And if you put quality on it, it becomes 150%. I just out Butter Prisms, so I didn't do it. And I mostly do mapping, not bossing, so I don't care much. We get a more damage multiplier for Bell here, and another one here. Generate here, so this just ends up scaling our Tempest Bell even. Does it do, like, more than double the damage than it would otherwise. Then Tempest Flurry. I don't use Tempest Flurry for damage. I use it to get the 4 hits that I need to place the bell, and to basically hit the bell a bunch, a ton of damage. To do that, I have more attack speed, to ramp it up faster. I have more shock chance to make it more consistently set up for shock on bosses, and I have lightning exposure for the few enemies that have too high resistance for our penetration. Which, speaking of, we're getting penetration from the soul cores in our Pillar of the Caged God, because this just lets us completely ignore resistances. I was considering using this here to pair with lightning exposure instead of penetration, and that way I could use other stuff inside of the pillar. Problem with that is just that lightning exposure pretty much only comes from the support gem, and it becomes pretty awkward to choose what you are applying it with, because if you're putting it on like Stormweaver, Tempest Flurry, then that means that your Herald of Ice isn't really experiencing the lightning exposure when it's going around corners hitting enemies. So eventually your Herald of Ice will run into a high resist enemy and damage because you're relying on lightning exposure. Whereas if you put on Herald of Ice, it's better for chaining, then you don't have access to lightning exposure for boss fights. So if you rely on that instead of penetration, you end up screwing over either your clear or your bossing. So I just chose to use penetration instead, and I'm just using the tiny bit of lightning exposure as some extra boss spread when I need it. End of Chayula is really nice. Completely bypasses the downside of Whispers of Doom, which is supposed to make curses take longer to apply, but this applies instantly. We can also technically apply Voltaic Mark with Hand of Chayula, but which is a mark that increases the effect of our shock. But I found it wasn't really necessary. And I also think... Actually, I'd have to check again, but last I checked, it seemed like it was additive with Magnitude, not multiplicative, which made me a lot less excited about it. And the increased curse effect on temp chains and review felt more valuable to me than that whole stuff. And onto our auras. Grim Feast is the strongest aura in the entire game. Every time we kill something, it drops a little orb thingy that we pick up, and that gives us a 200 flat energy shield, and that can go above our maximum, which is what lets us get to like a energy shield in maps. Herald of Ice is full of our damage, and the quality on it's really important. It gives it more radius, which ends up being like 22% more radius, which, importantly, more radius is a lot better than more area of effect. Just because of how the map on it checks out, I think where this 40% more area of effect actually only ends up being like 16% more radius. So the quality in Herald of Ice actually gives you more AoE than magnified effect, so make sure to get the quality. That's how you get those big juicy explosions. So for supports on, we go long shot. This essentially gives you more damage when against enemies further away from you, and as you saw, it's hitting enemies multiple screens away from us, so this is always giving us maximum damage pretty much. Magnified effect just helps it spread more. Innervate I really like. This is extra. This gives us gain damage, which you don't have a lot of, so it's like 35% more damage for our Herald of Ice, and for our other Herald, Herald of Thunder, and for Stormwave. So we just have a lot of extra damage while Herald of Ice is killing shocked enemies, which is pretty much all. Like if Herald of Ice procs, it's going to shock and kill an enemy, which will trigger this, and it'll buff itself as it keeps chaining, and it just feels incredible. And Bullseye is there to help with the accuracy problem I was talking about. Herald of Thunder I've kind of been on and off about. We essentially always have it active, so that's pretty fun. I have sometimes swapped this out with Berserk, because Berserk actually doesn't give you any health degen on your Chaos Inoculation, because it's percent based and you only have one life. And this essentially lets our Rage give us 45% more damage instead of 30%. So it can feel pretty nice. It also works during bossing, which Herald of Thunder doesn't. So I'm not super sure how effective this is, but it did feel pretty good. It's not mandatory, you can absolutely go without Herald of Thunder. It's by far the less important, but it's still decent, and Herald of Thunder actually can't shock itself, because similarly to how Herald of Ice can't freeze because it's a payoff skill, Herald of Thunder can't shock. Which means we can actually apply Electrocute with it, which is kind of funny. Just randomly electrocuted rares and packs with this. So, yeah, I'm not sure how much this is doing, but it's fun. And we have Blink on our soft, which is just extremely good. Very powerful tool. Their dodge roll helps us actually traverse the maps. And one last thing, because our auras end up adding to 90 Spirit Reservation, you end up with enough to either run Precision or Clarity. Both of these are good. I like Precision more for mapping, and I like Clarity more for bossing. Pick whichever one you. So, yeah, that's the rough build idea. I do have to say, some part of this will probably get nerfed, because GG is going to be back. I think they're actually already back, but they only came back in like a year or something. So we're probably going to see some nerfs next week, and a lot of things in this build look like they are primed for nerfs. Stat stackers have been doing disgusting things, so maybe Pillar of the Cage God or Hoa will be hit. Tempest Bell has way too high bossing damage, so that might get hit. Energy Shield has been noticeably ridiculous for survivability, and Stormweaver's Double Shock has done some disgusting things. So, and on top of all of this, Herald of Ice's whole recurring thing, where it's proccing off of chills of its own, even though it's enabled by Unique, might be removed in the same way that they removed the, how Warriors manage to recursively use Armor Explosion to trigger itself. It just doesn't seem like something that they'll keep around, so do keep an eye out for the nerfs next week, because if you're interested in trying this out, it might get hit. So I'd say wait for this before trying any. Anyway, that's all. Put some footage on for more mapping footage in the background to check out.
I can feel it. Die forgotten! Garukan favors me. Darukan favors me. A rare treasure.